have you played the Elden Ring DLC yet?
I actually haven't had the chance to. I'm unfortunately kind of bad at casually doing things, and so it's like I feel like if I got into that, I wouldn't leave a lot of time for getting anything else done. So I've heard great things though. Have you?
Yeah, I haven't played it yet. I've started a fresh Elden Ring playthrough, so I'm playing through the base game.
Oh,
And
nice.
once I finish that, I'm gonna jump into the DLC. And mainly because I was over leveled in my previous playthrough, I had spent a crazy amount of hours playing Elden Ring before, so I thought that I'm gonna be over leveled for the DLC. But from what I'm hearing, is no, you're not. Like even mobs can like one shot you, and it's absolutely crazy. I can't wait to get into it, though. I don't have. It's a time sucker, like you pointed out, right? And I don't have that much time to kind of blaze through the story and then get into DLC. So it's probably going to take me a little while. But I'm super excited about it, and I'm super excited that there are companies like From Software that are creating games that people actually like to play, like no hidden microtransactions, no sneaky fees, and I feel like that is a lot of what gaming does, and it's also, I feel, in many ways kind of aligns closely to your mission statement from what I was reading from the website and the vision behind Game 7.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, exactly on that. So, yeah, I mean, because I think the biggest thing about Game 7 was that, really one of our core tenets is like listen, then act, right? For us, we really hate the way that kind of the single few large companies is kind of like, just dominated the gaming space and really kind of force people to use these things like downloadable content and microtransactions, right? And it just seems very transactional and extractive. But what's kind of interesting was like, with that listen and act, then act in mind, we interviewed hundreds of game developers and thousands of game players. And, for the game players, they're understandably frustrated. This isn't something that's new, right? It's like game players
Yeah.
always complain, but I think there was like some really interesting nuance to what they were complaining about that we got. But what was most interesting to me was when we talked to the game developers, a lot of them are like, I hate nickel and diming my users, right? Like I just want to make fun content. I want to get reviews where people are like, this is amazing content. This was a fun game, right? And they just got really frustrated about hey, like quarter over quarter, you have to show growth. It's like, okay, well, let's bump up those microtransactions and let's reduce the amount of playable content, right? And so it was
Right.
interesting to see that both sides were very unhappy. And what we're kind of like proposing is that, with this next evolution of gaming being Web3 gaming, we really have an opportunity to change those things, to make it much more aligned for both game developers and game players. But really, what it's going to take is it's going to take a community effort, right? It's like everyone has to come
Mm.
together and agree on what these standards are, what the best practices are. And so rather than kind of having a few single companies that are really solely focused on profit maximization, it's like I think we could do something powerful. There's billions of gamers around the world. Like this is larger than most nation states, right? Like there's so much power if we're able to kind of unite and work together to try to push things forward. And that's really kind of like the space that we're coming from at Game 7 is like, let's make a meritocratic gaming nation. It's a very kind of like ambitious North Star, right? But those are the kind of projects that I love working on.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fascinating mission, and I feel like you need a mission like that to aim for. Like, it's always better to aim for something, for an ideal, rather than settle for something mediocre in between. I feel that's really important. You mentioned that you had some conversations with people in the gaming industry, developers and gamers alike. I'm really curious to hear about the game developers. Have they had any feedback in terms of the if those are the working hours they're putting in and the company culture and stuff like that? I know like there's kind of this idea that the game developers are overworked and in some cases not treated fairly. How true is that based on your guys' research?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is just because there's like so much pressure, right? Especially if you're trying to do an ambitious game, where it's like you need to get this out as fast as possible. I mean, I think the interesting kind of dichotomy between kind of like Web 2 and Web 3 is that Web 3 tends to move at like lightning speed. Everyone is just like, hey, like everyone jokes about like 1 year is in crypto is like 7 years in the real world, right?
Mm.
And so like, but kind of aligning that, if you look at these traditional studios for something like an MMO, it can take 7 to 10 years, right? For an FPS, can be like three to five
Oh
years.
yeah.
So like these are massive dev cycles that require tons of time and resources. And maybe they land, maybe they don't, right? We've seen some really well funded games in the Web2 space that haven't really performed that well. And so I think that's kind of interesting to see that balance between Web3 expects things to happen very quickly, but a lot of times you can't rush a game, right? You have to take time, be methodical, and there's so much that actually goes into it. I think that was the most interesting thing in talking with these game developers, right, from the traditional space, is like just seeing the amount of nuance, just thinking of like every kind of like click, right? Every kind of little pop up or modal, or kind of like the way that you're actually using colors, right, to like hit those dopamine receptors to make this delightful experience. I think like a lot of people just play games and they're like, I enjoy it, but really kind of like seeing those 2, 3, 4 layers below, everything is just so thoughtful to make something work. And it's just kind of incredible the amount of effort that gets put in, but it's very stressful. And obviously, trying to compress time cycles as much as possible to get the best content out there as soon as possible is a lot. Yeah.
No, it 100% is. And like you said, the development cycles 5, 7, 10 years to release a game. It's no easy task. It's a huge challenge, and I do understand the financial aspect of it, right? You want to make sure that after you've invested so much time and effort and money into this project, you want to come out the other side at the very least breaking even. You don't want to bleed cash, which is why I'm guessing that incentivizes companies like Ubisoft to, once they discover this magic formula, we're going to make Assassin's Creed 27, Assassin's, like, we're going to keep making them once a year like FIFA and stuff. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I enjoyed the first couple of Assassin's Creed games because it was like a unique story. It was original. It was fresh. But then I honestly don't understand who keeps playing them. But at this point, it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
the
I
same
mean,
thing
it's
all over again. You go around the map. You open bits of map around you, they're very grindy as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like you mentioned, right? It's a lot easier to iterate on existing content or existing IP than to do something entirely new, right? It's quicker development cycles to some extent, but then it's also like more likely to land. I think the interesting thing though is that if you have this kind of very well known and beloved IP and you flop, it's going to be really rough. I think we've seen a few games like that are just like, hey, like everyone loves this IP, we can put out whatever and people are going to play it, but I don't think that's always true. But I do think like just kind of like circling back. I mean, one of my favorite games, I think the best game of all time, honestly, was like World of Warcraft. And so kind of like
Right.
before the military, before crypto, before everything, like that was like it for me. It's like I played for 12 months and I had 6 months time played, and like I was playing 12 hours a day. And it's like for a year because it was just insane. It was like an entire world. I made some of the deepest and closest friendships during that time, right? And it's like it just the social element, the kind of achievement, the competitive aspect, and like the difference between directed play and free play. It was just beautiful for me. And so I think like a lot of that I've kind of distilled into my mental model of how we're thinking about Game 7 and kind of communities in general, right? I think a lot of communities are really kind of predicated on, hey, let's do like a Discord and Twitter, and we'll do a lot of these like social aspects of it. But I think what a lot of them are missing is like what makes that sticky, kind of like really that sustained player engagement is what everyone's searching for, right? Like that is kind of like the thing that you really want is how do you get people continually coming back? And I think like a lot of kind of communities inside and out of gaming, that's what they're searching for. But they really focus on vanity metrics. They're like, how do we get 1 million people on our Discord? But for me, it's like, how do I get 5,000 groups of 25 in my community? How do I engage them at that level? How do I have this macro competition, or macro coordination rather, but micro competition, right? Where kind of people can have this shared kind of like journey, shared destination, but really you have these smaller competitive elements that makes it so it's not just like, hey, this monolithic centralized company that like everyone's just following because they're in love with it, right? I think that's the special kind of differentiation between successful games and some communities that may not be as performant or optimized.
Yeah, and I totally agree that MMOs are this like it's almost like a magical kind of game. Like for me, MMOs were I love playing MMOs. I haven't played World of Warcraft, but I used to play Cabal Online. Um, it was this MMO that was, I think, ported from some Korean developers, and it got really popular in Europe. I think about 10 to 12 years ago,
Hmm.
maybe a bit more than that. And what made it an incredible experience for me is, like you said, you had all these groups of people, you had guilds, you had its own economy, it had its own, like, it made it such an engaging experience that the game would actually provide you with so much more value than single player experiences could provide you, like those rinse and repeat single player experiences. You would grind, you'd go and do the same dungeons with your friends time and time again, but there was something unique and fantastic about those experiences that I really really enjoyed. um, you've also mentioned that you got into, well, you got into military after World of Warcraft, and I did see that on your like spec, and I thought, I just remember the term explosive ordnance disposal technician, and I thought, dude, I gotta ask you about that because it sounds
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the journey for sure. I mean, my background's a little eclectic, but yeah, I was in the army for 5 years and I did EOD. So I mean, everybody always, like, a few people have seen the movie like Hurt Locker. That is like
Right.
very Hollywoodized version, right? But it's like, yeah, I mean, learned how to kind of like render safe and, basically disarm bombs. And did a
Yeah.
deployment to Afghanistan, and yeah,
Oh, wow.
it was quite the experience for sure.
Yeah, I bet it was. How did you get into EOD specifically? Was it something you were specifically interested in?
I mean, for me, it was like, my parents were extremely blue collar, and it's like, I wanted to go to kind of like the best schools, but we couldn't really afford it, and so I was a little
Right.
bit frustrated at that. So for me, it was like I was doing research, and I'm like, hey, like, what is the best path to get to where I want to be? And I started looking around, and it's like, hey, like, if I join the military, I can not only start to work on my degree while I'm in. But I can also get the GI Bill after the fact, and it can pay for, pay my way towards school. So for me, like, my original plan was, get my bachelor's while I'm in the military, then go to law school. Obviously things change, like I was only able to get my associates because, like, you know, trying to work full time, be in the military, deploy, all of that, and do full time school is very challenging. And then also when I got out, I was just not that passionate about law anymore. For me, it was
Yeah.
like entrepreneurship. I was like, this is probably the path I'm most interested in. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it was like, I want to pay for school. Okay, what's the biggest bonus? It was like either special forces or EOD. EOD had like the bigger bonus. And my recruiter was like, "Hey, you get to go to Florida. It's a year training. You get to sit on the beach, blow up stuff." I'm like, "Hey, this is awesome." But then I got in, and it like turns out there's like an 80% fail out rate. It's like one of the most challenging schools in the military, and so I expected to be physically challenged, but it was also very mentally challenging.
Right.
So just ended up really falling in love with it, and got quite lucky picking it. It was a very great experience.
Well, congratulations on your years of service. How many years did you serve for?
For 5, yeah,
5 years, all in EOD.
yep, yeah, correct.
Wow, that's crazy. And did you you said you were challenged mentally? Did you have to learn like engineering about how like explosive devices work and how to reverse engineer it? I'm guessing.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's like, I mean, so there's like traditional ordnance, which it's all the bombs and missiles and rockets and things that you kind of think of. But then there's kind of the other side of it, which is a lot more applicable because it's like obviously with like Iraq and Afghanistan, like a lot of it was improvised explosive devices, and so like
Right.
most of the stuff we were seeing out there is literally pallet boards with like a flip flop spacer. You have like a carbon rod D cell battery used as kind of like the point of contact, and then like you've had like a 9-volt battery, and then you have like I don't know, like a 1 liter oil canister filled with kind of like ammonium nitrate, right? So it's like super simple stuff. Probably costs like $10 to make, right? But it's like
Right.
had to learn kind of all of the traditional kind of ordnance, but then really specialize, based on kind of where we were deploying to, on improvised explosive devices. So, yeah, like I said, it's like a 9 month school. So you learn a ton there. And then you get to your unit, you basically learn, hey, like forget most of the stuff you learned, like learn stuff about kind of the area of operations you're going to. So, yeah, a lot of knowledge I most likely won't use. Although I would say, a couple of years ago, I ended up joining Marana as like managing partner for their family office. But then they started this BitDAO initiative, and this fantastic artist named Shloms came up with
Mm.
the idea of like, hey, like his whole shtick is kind of like we can destroy things, but kind of create art out of them.
Right.
And he was like, what if we blew up a Lamborghini? I was like,
Fair.
wait a
Okay.
second, like I didn't think I'd ever be using this skill set. But it was actually funny. Like we ended up going to Las Vegas, and one of the guys who was doing all the demo was like an XEOD guy, and so we were talking about like shape charges and flex linear shape charge, like where to actually put things to like blow it up, but actually kind of keep it whole enough to distribute after the fact. And yeah, so anyway, bit of a tangent, but it's kind of funny. It's like a skill set I never thought I'd really use in the civilian world that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm guessing that there's still probably a niche in movie making and special effects and stuff like that where the like it's skills like you'd normally think that I wouldn't be used that are probably have a good purpose in these kind of like creative industries.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it was like it was kind of interesting because it's like for me, I was kind of 50-50 on staying in the military because
Right.
it's like I ended up really enjoying it. It's like super small group. You get to work with special operations a lot of the time, like when you're deployed, and like it was it was just really interesting. But actually, on my last deployment, I ended up getting blown up. Somebody
Fuck.
behind me stepped on an IED, so ended up getting medevaced. Had like a year long kind of recovery. Had 13 surgeries, um, and I ended up having to get medically retired from the military because of that. Um, and then for me, it was like I had all this free time while I'm going through physical therapy, and I happened upon the Bitcoin white paper in 2013. And for me, it was like, okay, going through this weird transition, I don't know what I'm going to do, right? And then I find these crypto folks, right? These Bitcoiners, and they're like, hey, we can change the world, we can improve it, we can make everything better, And I was like, this kind of like idealism, this optimism for me was like infectious. And that's really kind of when I started going down the rabbit hole in crypto because I'm like, these are my kinds of people, the people who are like, hey, we have these existing systems and structures, but like, why? Just like
Mhm.
questioning, can we do this better? Can we improve this? Right. And I think that was kind of like, just a point along the journey, right? Where it's like, for me, I think community has really been everything. It's like, not to go too far back, but it was like I was in a very kind of like a very uh like a jazz band that was like very competitive, right? We competed a lot, and then I went into the military, and it was like this very kind of specialized, kind of like elite group, right? And then ended up going to Berkeley and a few other things, right? But it's like I feel like all of those things have all been about the community, right? World of Warcraft, all of this stuff, right? It's all been about the people that I've surrounded myself with that have like motivated me and driven me. And I just think it's just like so interesting, and that's really why every time I start thinking about what I'm doing, it's just like how do I better engage communities, right? How do I make more powerful, kind of strong communities? Yeah,
That's a fantastic story, dude. It's an incredible story.
thanks.
And it's a really unique way of getting into crypto and blockchain. Um, I think 2013 was about the time where I first kind of learned about Bitcoin, and I was mining on my GPU on my device, and I don't think I ever actually managed to get access to that crypto again. Like I set up this wallet, I've been mining for a while, forgot the wallet, and then I got back into crypto in 2017. So I always say that like I've entered crypto twice because of that.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't a lot going on, right? It's like kind of like the whole Mount Gox hack was really why it was like a little bit like more. It was some buzz around it, and I tried to like stay really plugged into like what's going on in tech, kind of like where's tech going, and like it's like just I feel like I just kind of really got lucky, just kind of like happening into it, and then like meeting people who are just so passionate about it. Because like yeah, 2013 like Mount Gox happened, but then 2014, 15 was like just hovering from like $200 to $400, and like every time like there were rumors that China was going to ban Bitcoin, it was like wow, like Bitcoin could actually die. It's like I actually had this alert system that notified me every time Bitcoin was mentioned on kind of like Google search results, and like so every morning I'd wake up and I would spend like a couple hours a day like reading every time Bitcoin was mentioned, just to like try to just ingest as much content and information. I was always on this like whale call TeamSpeak, just trying to like listen to traders, right, and like understand what was going on, learn how to trade, like learn markets. Looking back to that now, it's like imagine if you set up an alert that notified you anytime something crypto related was mentioned. It's just insane. Like just the exponential growth has been incredible, and I think that's like what I'm like most deeply passionate about. Is like I will always bet on millions of people being able to permissionlessly contribute because that's what allows for fractal growth, right? It's like you have thousands of people, millions of people throwing stuff at a wall, something sticks, something hits, and then all of a sudden thousands of people can then build onto that, right?
Oh yeah.
And just the pace of development, you just see this exponential curve. And I think that's something that's so powerful. And it's really why we've situated Game7 to be a DAO, to be community oriented, to be owned, run, kind of championed by the community, because I think it's just a much more optimal structure in the mid to long term.
Yeah, and I mean that's what the internet was at the beginning. In the 90s, people were just figuring out what this technology is and how to kind of make it work. And you had different people building different forums, all communicating and connecting with each other. Like the internet was never supposed to be owned by Google, Amazon, and Facebook, And I stand firmly with against that. Like Google owns over 99% of the world's search traffic, and AWS owns over 50% of all computing on the internet. Like, if AWS goes down, like takes down half of the internet with it. It also is going to take down validator nodes for God knows how many blockchains, because a lot of validators go like, well, yeah, I could roll my own, but that's a lot of hassle, so I'm just going to rent like this cheap computer in the cloud and just create a node that way, which I get it, but also, is that really decentralized if we're talking about decentralization?
Yeah, and I think that's like for me at like the protocol level, this kind of like you know, progressive decentralization or path to decentralization. I think like having kind of been in the space for a long time, it's like I probably have a little bit more extreme views on that, right? Where it's like I think it's so easy to be like, hey, like we want bleeding edge performance, at all costs. But that cost is really the whole point of blockchain, in my opinion, right? It's like you're kind of like giving up efficiency for something else. And like, what is that something else is like trust, right? So like, if you're able to trust, you get decentralized trust. Like that's such an interesting primitive. Whereas like you're
Mhm.
saying, right? If you have like 90% of the network hosted on AWS instances, if those go down, it's kind of like over, right? And so I think like there's kind of this interesting dialogue going on right now in the Ethereum community, right? Where it's like, hey, like we need to scale faster. So it's like, what concessions can we make? You see this in all these different communities, right? Where it's like, I think if you're talking about kind of like Solana, or you're talking about Ethereum, or you're talking about any of these like L2s or L1s, like all of them are just making different concessions. And I don't think there's like a right or a wrong, right? I think it's very interesting to see how it plays out. But what I really enjoy about Web3 is that, if you, I don't, to kind of go down this like Harari path, I'm a huge fan like of a kind of like some of his books, right? But he talks about like these millions of experiments that have kind of gotten us here. But I
Yeah.
think with kind of like this movement toward like nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction, you have much less experiments, right? Like borders are quite locked. There's like much less large scale wars. Obviously, there's a lot of these small proxy wars that I'm deeply familiar with, but it's like you don't have these giant upheavals and these giant social movements as much. Whereas I think you have this kind of layer above now, and it's kind of like this cloud communities, right? These like digital nations, and you can really bring back a lot of that experimentation and start to see that progress. And so I think that's what's cool to me is right is like you have this physical world that is generally kind of stagnant. There's a lot of frustration that things aren't changing or moving or progressing, and it's for a lot of reasons. Whereas you have this virtual nation, these virtual communities that are literally just speed running governance, speed running economics, speed running all of these core primitives that are already sort of deep seated in the traditional world, right? And it's really interesting to see that some of the things that don't work in the real, like the physical world, still don't work in the digital world, right? Whereas maybe other things are enabled by new technology, right? And we can actually try things in a new and novel way.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. And in fact, the virtual world is only a representation of the physical world and what we've built as humans in the physical space. So if you're thinking about technologies or considering certain technologies potentially dangerous or whatever, well, you go back to human nature. That is human nature. Some people will take advantage of stuff. Some people will be greedy. Some people will exploit systems. That doesn't mean that we should stop innovating or we should put people like the guy that's developed Tornado Cash in jail for life because he's developed a protocol to anonymize, Bitcoin. I think that's nuts. Like, take that code line by line. Show me where is the illegal code. Has he used illegal characters that just can't be used? Every line of that code is legal. Yet the product, and he was charged with laundering money himself, which he did not. It's crazy that it's going that way. But I'm also happy that it's decentralized systems, decentralized governments, DAOs that are creating, these communities that cannot be governed in that way. Like you cannot really hold a DAO responsible in the same way that you hold a private company or a limited company responsible. And I find that really interesting. I'm really curious to hear, because obviously you're working with DAOs. If there are any, like, what are the differences in regulation? Do you have any kind of, regulatory challenges that you're facing, or because it's a DAO, because it's decentralized, you've got a bit more freedom to play with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the really interesting part, right? Is it's like different shades of gray. Like, I think you can talk to anyone, legal, et cetera, in the space, and like no one will be like, hey, like this is the right way to do it. It's clearly black and white, right? I think a lot of the stuff when you get into tokens and DAOs and communities, right? It's like there's different shades of gray. I think every country is kind of taking a different stance and policy on it, and like kind of like there's a bunch of different law firms that are taking different stances on it. And so really, it's like what's the most risk minimized way of doing it? Um, but it's not necessarily right or wrong. So that's another kind of like leaning back to that rapid experimentation, right? Is a bunch of people are trying new structures and trying new things, right? And seeing what works. I think like you have kind of like the end of the spectrum, something like UkiDAO, right? That CFTC came after because it was like, hey, like you're kind of decentralized, but you're also trading financial products. Like, what are you doing? This is
Right.
clearly illegal, right? And then you have like the bleeding edge of like, hey, like, you can't do anything, right? You can't market it, you can't even talk about it, you can't do anything. But it's like, okay, well, that's kind of extreme. How do you actually build a community, or how do you build anything if you're just like, hey, like can't do anything for it, can't support it, no one can like help kind of like push things forward. And so I think like striking that balance, and really what it's all predicated on is like true decentralization. I think like where I'm taking a standpoint of like, I think from a protocol perspective, like progressive decentralization is very hard because you get caught into the fact of like, hey, we have a bunch of efficiency, we don't want to give that up to be more decentralized. Like we're already kind of here. I think it's very hard to go back. Whereas I do think for DAOs, especially something like Game7 that has a very large treasury, you can't necessarily just be like, hey, we have a massive treasury. Here's a bunch of tokens to everybody. Like, hopefully you don't do crazy stuff with it, right? So I do think on this community management, progressive decentralization does make sense. And that's why we've taken the stance with Game7 that it's like we have three separate phases. So the first phase is like core team. You have kind of like a forum, you have kind of input from the community. Like, you really try to have this spirit of we want the community guiding and shaping, and we want to build structures that a community can help add to and evolve. But at the same time, you have a core team that's kind of directing things, keeping things on the rails, right? Being ultimately kind of like, very involved. Then you have this phase two where it's saying, hey, like we've created these structures, which happy to deep dive DAO structures, but I don't know if it's interesting to you. But it's like
Oh no,
phase
I,
two
I
is
love I love that stuff.
okay.
I would love to hear about it. I was actually I meant to ask you about it. I was talking to the author of the DAO, like back from the 2015 at some
Yeah.
point, and he's heard this joke that really stuck in my head. He said, I sometimes say that DAO stands for dudes arguing online. So I really wanted to ask you about how you guys manage governance and everything.
Yeah, I mean governance. I'm super passionate about. So I mean we can go down that rabbit hole. But I guess to like touch on a few things, it's like for me, it's like I've been a member of quite a few different DAOs. I mean, I'm definitely not one of the OG like original DAO creators, right? Or like the Mullik DAO, right? Or like Aragon, or like some of these early entrants. I appreciate, we stand on the shoulder of giants kind of thing, right? But kind of like my take for it is that I've just seen time and time again that you give people tokens and you have this $1, one token, one vote, and
Right.
that doesn't incentivize people to do anything. It's like it's actually like a disincentive. It's like saying, hey, like hopefully the early people who got the tokens, or the early people who had a lot of money to buy the tokens, are going to continue pushing this forward in a positive way for the next 2, 3, 4 years. That's really not true. One, you have really low voter turnout, right? And two, you have a lot of people who are kind of free riding. They're like, hey, I'm going to buy this governance token, and hopefully the people who are putting in effort make it worth more. And it just turns into this like weird speculative thing that's not really predicated on success or engagement. And so, kind of like what we're trying to do at Game7 is saying, hey, like we really explored this like economic contribution, right? As kind of like one of these core primitives for how to like run a community. But we really want to introduce something else and have a spectrum where it's like, what if we only cared about the time and effort and engagement that you put into the community? And so that's really kind of like where the portal came from that we've launched, where we're saying, hey, like we want to build a meritocratic nation. That's like kind of what we put in the original proposal. And we're like, okay, like that's exciting. I'm really interested in this kind of like meritocratic nation, but how do you actually do that? right? Um, and in order to do a meritocratic nation, you have to understand very granularly what are people's contributions. And so that's through the portal. We've actually said, hey, if you're playing games, if you're voting on governance proposals, if you're active on Discord, if you're active on Twitter, right? If you're like completing quests, right? That is something that you can build your reputation, you can build your level in a very kind of MMO-esque way. And so when you paint that
Right.
spectrum, I think almost any community fits there, right? Where it's saying, hey, maybe I care 60% about your economic contribution and I care 40% about your actual engagement and the time and effort you put into it. But like somewhere on that spectrum, I would love to see, I'm loving to see kind of like all this experimentation take place where it's not just $1, one token, one vote. It's really tokens and votes for things that are relevant to that. But then you also have engagement where it's actually people's merit. They're just kind of like deeming like how much access, how much control, how much say should they have in certain things.
Right. Yeah. And I mean that's kind of proof of work in a sense, but just for individuals, right? Just showing that they've. Did you call it proof of play? Did I read that right? Was it on your website? I've read proof of play.
No,
Um,
no, yeah, we don't call it proof of play. Yeah, I mean, I think that's I'm trying to. I mean, proof of play is like Pirate Nation. It's kind of like the parent company. That's what they call it. Which
right.
fantastic game by the way. But yeah,
Yeah, because I think you absolutely need to have a system in place to make sure that the members of your DAO are actually engaged and active in the DAO rather than speculative reasons, especially when cryptos become so speculative. And it didn't used to be, right? Bitcoin, you did have the novelty about it. So people were just buying Bitcoin, creating the nodes because of the novelty. But then it became once you had altcoins coming out and then meme coins, it became so speculative. And I think this current bull cycle is probably the most speculative that I've ever seen. Because in the previous bull cycle, yes, we had meme coins and Ethereum and a couple of other chains like BNB and a few others, but now there's just so many being pumped out on Solana because it's just so cheap that anyone could just create their own meme coin within like a couple of hours. Uh,
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's it's kind of the problem, right? Is that I think like there is so much innovation, and again that fractal growth, I'm all for it because I think it's like a beautiful structure, and I think it like better is for the betterment of everyone. But you have this cycle where it's like everyone's launching a coin, everyone's launching a project. Some are extremely legitimate, right? But it's like if you have all these tokens, it's like who's actually buying, who's excited about them. And then so what you've had is you've had these like professional kind of like bot networks, professional Sybil networks that are like trying to act like a real user for the sake of just getting as many tokens as possible to make as much as much money off of it as possible, and that's like deeply problematic, right? And you've had a lot of communities that I think Layer Zero was a really interesting
mm,
experiment, right? Where they're saying like, hey, like we're basically going to reward people for finding and identifying Sybils. Like initially, we're going to let people turn themselves in, and we'll actually give them a piece of their airdrop for actually being honest. But then after that, we're going to like engage all of these analysts and all of the community that if you turn somebody in, you can get a percentage of what the bot network would have gotten. Super interesting.
right. It
Then you have
is.
something like ZK Sync that's saying like, hey, like we're just going to have it predicated on who is taking high risk activities, because bot networks probably aren't going to take high risk activities, right? They're going to do things that they don't lose money. It looks like activity, but then they can just like free roll basically tokens. There's been negative kind of like conversations about all of that. I think in general, like trying to distribute a token, like first principles, you're trying to distribute tokens to people who are engaged, who are real, because you hope that they help you continue to build your network. And again, that positive community engagement is what they're trying to seek. And so for me, it's like, why don't you just start from that standpoint? Like, why are you trying to cherry pick all these data points that you're going to have false positives, you're going to have false negatives? Like, as soon as somebody does a good structure that works really well, all the bots are going to start doing that same structure, and then you have to change it for the next one. It's just like this game of cat and mouse, where the way we're trying to orient it again is merit. It's like if we can have a structure where it's like you have to put real time and effort into things, not just transactions on chain, but even like on chain and off chain, right? If you can increase that kind of social graph and understanding of your users, I think it offers something very different where it's like if you've spent like on Game7 portal, for instance, if you've spent dozens of hours playing games and contributing in a positive way on the forum and voting and being active in Discord and like all of these different data points, if you figured out how to bot that, I probably want you in my community because you're actually engaging in like a very like positive and meaningful way, and like you've spent a lot of time and effort. And so I think effort for me is the best Sybil resistance. And again, like with enough time and effort, it is you can bot anything. Like let's be blunt about that, right? So it's like it's just resistant, it's not Sybil proof. But I really think predicating Sybil resistance on engagement and effort is probably like a better outcome than trying to cherry pick different on-chain data points, etc., to figure out who's real and who's not.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And you can bot everything, but just like you said, if you have all of these steps in order to earn basically your stay, so to speak, in the DAO, then by all means you want that person in that DAO. Like they could have gone and created macros for all sorts of other on-chain actions that they could take, but they've chosen to just spend all of their time trying to make it work for your specific use case. That takes effort. I'm sure there's a 13-year-old taking notes right now doing this tomorrow or something, but that's
For
in a
sure.
sense that's the beauty of it.
Yep.
um
Yeah.
I was also going to ask about, you said something about obviously you're having a core team and working with the wider DAO to make decisions. How does that relationship work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like to kind of give a little bit of context. I mean, for me, this is such an interesting problem because, like, previously being in kind of like more of like the technical cryptography kind of like, like theory space, like it's very math based, right? There's solutions. Whereas like when you're dealing with people aren't necessarily rational. It's a very hard problem, like coordinating all of these things. And so I think again, like the problem is when you kick off a community, you want a structure in place that is clear enough that people can participate and engage in a meaningful way. And so it's like, how do I have a structure that is kind of rigid enough, or defined enough that people feel like I can just jump in, I can go into your Discord, I can go into the Game7 portal, and I can immediately start contributing in a positive way. So like I know the rules, I know your goals, I know what you're trying to do, I know what you're about, right? Like making that onboarding as easy as possible is very important. But then the
Yeah.
other piece of that is that you're saying, hey, like this is a set game. Like here's the chessboard, here are the rules, here's all you can do. There's a ton of creativity that can happen into that, but we want to obviously it's like chess has infinite possibilities, right? Not infinite, but a lot, but it's like um how do we allow the structure of our community to be flexible enough that we can shift, that we can change, right? Again, the goal of Game7 is to be this meritocratic nation. If you're trying to go to the size and scale of a nation state, there has to be a lot of room for movement and change, right? And so you have to have like these defined rules, but you can't have it too defined and too rigid that people feel like they can't contribute. And so, right back to your original question, it's like for this first phase, we basically said, hey, like, here is a level system, here's an XP system. You have a soulbound avatar, you can earn items, you can kind of like level up, right, by doing these different quests. But really, what we're leveraging the community for is what content should that progression path be based off of? Like, what are the games you're excited about? What are the games you want to play? Because like for us, it's if we want people to engage to build up their level to eventually run the DAO. If it's a gaming nation, what better way than playing games, right? And so we've really leveraged our community by saying, hey, like, what are the games you want? What are you excited about, right? Like, what are the most interesting stuff? What's the most rewarding stuff? Trying to highlight that to our community. So as far as content, that's where we've really been focusing on. Whereas kind of for phase two, we're going to be shifting into, hey, like you need to elect leadership for all these sub DAOs. And I guess I kind of glossed over it in the beginning, right? But it's like that phase two, like phase one transition is predicated on, I think that all token holders shouldn't vote on every single thing. If I'm saying like, hey, like what color should we change the background of our portal? Like you don't need a token vote for that, right? But I do think you
Mhm.
need to have a formal hierarchy of who's deciding that. And so what we were really trying to push toward is like basically having all these small sub DAOs and delegate control of the DAO out to the periphery. Because that's how you make an efficient, flexible, kind of like progressive DAO, in my opinion. Um, but then again, all token holders, if something starts going off the rails, they can remove those sub DAOs, right? They can take away their budget. There's a lot of things they can do, right? But
Right.
yeah, yeah. So anyway, that's kind of like a little peek into kind of like where we're going. It's like I think it's dozens of these sub DAOs that are all coordinated by this large superset DAO, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So it's more you're taking a bit of decentralization and a bit of distributed network, and you're kind of creating a really interesting interplay between them, because I completely acknowledge that decentralized networks have one issue, and that being that yes, it is technically decentralized, but also two people can take ownership of that network, or a small group. But if you distribute ownership across these what you call sub DAOs, I feel like you get a better level of overall decentralization and distribution of power in decision making for the entirety of the organization. It's a great solution for it.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I think it's again, it's an experiment. We'll see how it lands, right? And like see what works, see what doesn't. But I think that's the fun aspect of it, right? I think the other
Yeah.
piece too is it's going to be really interesting to see like if people are elected, right? Because like there's other DAOs, there's other ecosystems that have kind of this board, right, or these people who are responsible for making decisions. But what we've realized is that it's usually the person who's like the loudest or the most popular.
Mm.
But what's kind of interesting that I've seen in a couple of different communities is that the person who's the most popular, the most well known, probably getting chosen for a bunch of different things. And so if you're sitting on 20 different boards, are you really engaging the most, right? And so like having these elections based off of, hey, this person's put a couple of hundred hours, right? They've done every single content. They've done a bunch of different bounties, they've been super vocal, they've been consistently present. Like that's I think what we're trying to optimize for, because having that context, knowing the community, right, kind of having a finger on the pulse, I think is what the leadership of these decentralized communities needs if they're to be chosen. It's not just, hey, this person has a ton of Twitter followers, they're super popular, like they probably know what's best. Because I think it's like a bit of detriment to the community if they only have an hour a month to spend on it, right? Like you're probably not going to get the best outcome than somebody who's there every single day trying to figure things out.
It's very true. Yeah. And you guys are currently in phase one right now of the
Correct.
DAO.
Yeah, so we launched like the community portal end of April. So we've been live, coming up on 2 months now, and so it's really like how do we have that foundation for of merit, right? How do we have that kind of foundation of who of someone's reputation, really? So then we can start saying, hey, like what are the core things that the DAO needs? And let's start helping create some of these committees, right? Create some of these initial governance processes, and really kind of write this like constitution S structure, right? Where it's like, maybe you can look at the DAO as like the federal system, and then you can like look at the sub DAOs as the state system, and then
Right.
they can have subcommittees being the cities, right? Or like the like little like local ecosystem. So like this nation state kind of parallel that I mentioned, like this gaming nation, is like really how we're starting to kind of like look through how things are facilitated.
I love that. And because it's the kind of experiment that it can inform real world governance. That one of the things I love about DAOs is that you have different governance in place that can completely well if they can't make a change right now in the real world, at least we can learn that hey, there are arguably better ways of governing anything from countries to top down company structures to supermarket managers to anything in between. And it's super fascinating to every time I kind of have a conversation with people like you that are kind of building these things to see what else has been tested, what else is being built right now in terms of governance. And that's fascinating. I also meant to ask you what kind of games can you play at the moment in Game 7? Are there any games released?
Yeah, so like specifically not games that we have built, although I would give a quick shout out to Market Wars. Like if you're into MMOs and World of Warcraft, I think you'll really like it. So that's something that we'll be releasing a little bit later this year.
Ooh.
So I'm personally
World
very
of Warcraft. You're gonna be playing World of Warcraft and participating in Game 7 governance with your World of Warcraft activity.
so it's based off of World of Warcraft. So it's not specifically World of Warcraft, but it's a very interesting twist on it that I think is quite. It's very very Web3 aligned, but really focused on kind of because I guess to circle back really quickly, right? It's like for us when we were listening in our listening phase for Game 7, what we figured out was that there were kind of three big problems that a lot of these game developers are having. It was like one of it was infrastructure. That we're like, okay, you have some of these chains as a service startups, which is great. It's like, okay, cool. You have a chain, you have a token. And then the developers are like, cool, I have a game. How do I mash these together? Like I feel like I have like 60% of the puzzle, but what's the other 40%, right? And so the infrastructure is really a piece we want to focus on. The other is distribution, right? So it's like let's have a portal, let's have a very like a robust community that's engaged, that's not bots, that is real people that we can then orient them to things that are interesting in the space, right? And then really the other one is sustained player engagement. How do you get people who aren't just trying to farm out those tokens? People who really want to engage in a meaningful way and find a community that they align with and resonate with. And so it's like by really kind of like focusing on those pieces, we were like, what better way to figure out and trial a lot of these tools that we're building than to give an example, right? I think a lot of companies in the space have said, like, let's build infra. If we build infra, everyone else will figure it out. But for us, what we realized in doing these dev reports is that by building things ourselves, we've gotten so much more depth where it's like, hey, like my problem is that, people don't like playing. And we're like, no, it's really like the UX, and the UX is predicated on the login, which is like predicated on the auth system. So it's like by kind of drilling down to like, okay, like what are the fundamental problems, not the symptoms, has been super helpful. And so for us, we're like, hey, like let's launch a game that we think is very fun, very compelling, and then we can kind of like use it to highlight a lot of the infrastructure distribution and sustained player engagement mechanics that we started developing ourselves, and then hopefully distribute and share that with the rest of the Web3 community.
That's a great way of going about it. That's really cool. So the games that are being built for Game 7, are there games that are specifically Web3 games, or could they just be regular Web2 games or off-chain games that then, kind of funnel back into the idea of governance? Because the reason I'm asking is I was playing around with it and I created this avatar, and that's when I realized that my avatar is kind of like my persona for the governance of Game 7, but not something that I would be expected to use to interact with in a 3D world or something like that.
Well, I would say a little bit of alpha. They're all game ready. All those avatars are game ready.
Ah,
So it's been some conversations of how to introduce that into some games, right? To just like make it much more immersive and useful, and that like add additional utility to the soulbound token. Um, but I would say that shout out to like our sister company, Hyperplay. Really, it's one of the big pieces of our distribution plan. In addition to the portal, is they're a Web3 native game launcher and like game store. And so what's nice is you can actually connect your Epic Game Store and play all the traditional games like Web2 games
oh wow,
alongside your Web3 games. And so for the Web3 games, they have this really cool overlay that you can stay immersed in the game, right? You don't actually have to like minimize, approve the transaction on your wallet, right? It's a lot better experience. But I would say like a little bit of peek into what our plan is that again, we're a gaming DAO. We want people who just enjoy playing games. And kind of like my stance is that right now we have this interim, are you a Web3 game or a Web2 game? I think that is like a short-term thing. I think eventually it's just gaming. I think like having it be a blockchain or a Web3 game, it has to be one fun, like it's like blockchain should just really be a feature. It shouldn't
right,
really be your entire marketing pitch. Like, because then you get the people who are speculating and the people who are just trying to farm it out. And then it becomes this like weird extractive kind of like economic financial game. Right. And so I think like
100%.
people are starting to thoughtfully introduce blockchain for what it's good at, but really again, redirect to, hey, I just need to build a compelling game. And blockchain is an extra tool in my toolkit that I think is very powerful, right? Like, don't get me wrong. I think it's a fantastic technology. It's really going to level up gaming, as far as like community ownership and flexibility, right? And like yeah, like composability. But yeah, again, but yeah, I guess to circle back, like Hyperplay, you can play Web2 games, Web3 games, where you have a direct collaboration with them. Obviously, being a sister company of Game 7, that as you play any games on that, you're going to be able to level up and build your reputation on things like Fortnite or whatever you'd like.
That's a really cool thing. I didn't expect you'd have that level of integration with with regular games. So we're gonna keep calling them regular games for now. But I completely agree with the sentiment, because when I go and play a game, I never question. Oh, have you built this in Unity? Have you used C# or Python, or have you used like a water flow, or have you used agile development to build it? Like those things are not really relevant to me as a gamer. What is relevant, like you point out, is my experience with the game. Is it a good game? Does it have a good story? Is it fun to play? And I think that's where the story ends. And I also think that's exactly where I've seen other Web3 gaming companies that go out of their way to advertise these games as Web3 games. Whereas, okay, great, you're using a new technology, but like, what is the unique selling point there? Is just a new technology that, you're going to capture probably the most engaged segment of this Web3 market. But like the more casual gamers, people just want to play games because they like playing games. you're probably going to miss out, and you're probably going to alienate a lot of people by calling them Web3 games.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that's definitely going to happen in the future, and it's even as simple as a branding thing. Like there's
Yep.
no really any infrastructure change needed to stop calling it a Web3 game. It's just, yeah, it's a game. Oh yeah, if you're interested, if you're curious, it uses Web3, but you don't need to worry about it.
Yep. 100%. Yeah. And I think like a lot of that is like the main point of friction is connecting a wallet. Like you
Yeah.
have to get a wallet, you have to connect a wallet, you have to be comfortable with a wallet, you have to do transactions, right? And I think like with account abstraction and like a lot of these um, kind of technologies that are being pushed, like, you know, being able to kind of pre-auth certain transactions, like up to a certain extent, right? By being able to like, because your wallet is a smart contract, you can actually predefine like what's something that is maybe slightly less secure, but makes your user experience better, right? So like, and then the other piece is how, um, how can you make somebody allow someone to like easily onboard with something they already have, right? Where it's like we have a lot of these biometrics in our phone, you know, like a lot of kind of like touch ID or face ID. It's like, why can't your wallet be based off of that? And so I think there's like a ton of work going on. I think by the end of the year we're going to be well on our way. Because again, it's like, you know, if somebody has to be like, hey, go download MetaMask, you know, or go download some other wallet, it's like that's a point of friction and you're going to lose a ton of people. And so I think if you can handle the onboarding, then you're going to start to see like a lot of that complexity abstracted away. And then it's going to be a much more seamless integration. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I've seen that being done recently with. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, Horizon.io. They're a Web3 gaming company. I spoke with Michael, and he explained to me that they're basically created a sequence builder, like a Web3 game engine builder, where it takes care of all of these things under the hood: wallet creation, NFT creations, like if your character is a 721, and then you have other NFTs that you own, then you have a wallet that owns all of these things. But the idea is that the user doesn't even need to know about this. um, that's the long-term plan, just not having the user deal with that complexity of like creating wallets and approving transactions. And what would be pretty cool, because you're talking about biometrics, you could hook into the device's camera or whatever, just read your face as you're playing the game, confirm, okay, biometrics confirmed, proceed with that transaction, all under the hood. You wouldn't even know it's happening. You could
Yep.
totally do stuff like that.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where we're headed. I mean, like, hopefully it's not like, you know, eyeball scanning and, you know, they're
Yeah.
containing. And I think there's like a
WorldCoin.
whole, yeah, yeah. Well, they pivoted away from that a little bit, right? But, you know, I think like, you know, it's just like, let's not try to get too, you know, Black Mirror esque, right? You know, but it's like, I do think that,
Mhm.
there's a lot of work being done on that onboarding piece. And I think that's one of the last big barriers. Cause I think there's quite a few different experiments taking place right now for like the scaling aspect of it. But I do think that onboarding part is still a point of friction that um, dozens of companies, like you mentioned, Coinbase Wallet, I think has a fantastic experience with their new release. Like Horizon, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of folks like OpenFort, et cetera, who are like, just account abstraction unlocks a lot of potential there. And I think that's where we're going to see the most innovation over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, yeah, and I think in the longer term as well, for the like overall crypto and blockchain ecosystem, I think account abstraction will eventually get us to a point where the people are no longer going to be concerned with what chain they're using. You're just going
Yep.
to connect to Web3 via a gateway that just abstracts away everything. And I think that's exactly the point that it needs to get to really reach mainstream adoption. Until that happens, I've probably said this, and apologies if everyone listening is just listening to this for the fifth time, but um, if you're new to crypto in 2024 and you want to get into it, dude, it's not like 2013 anymore. It's so confusing. Like, I
Yeah.
wouldn't know where to start. I would just be
Yep.
like, this is too much. I'm just gonna ignore it.
Agreed. I mean, that's why like you know, I think we really want to add social logins, right? Where you can just use your Google account or your Twitter account. But I mean, I won't get too down the rabbit hole, but like there's a lot of concerns with like some of the current kind of like implementations of that because a lot of them are walled gardens that, you know, if I use my Twitter account to log into your website, but I use it in another one, because of a lot of the kind of like business models of these companies, if I have three websites and I use the same email to log into all three, I'll have three different wallets. For me, that's crazy because it's like they're
Right.
charging 2 cents per wallet per month, per active wallet per month, and so it's like they don't want you to have a unified wallet, right? But I do think that's something that's like this interim thing, that there's a lot of momentum to push this more unified kind of schema, right? Because it's like, as a new user, talk about confusing. It's not only do I have all these chains to deal with, but I also have like all these wallets from the same email. And I'm like, am I log into website A's wallet with this email or log site? So I think like, but directionally, like where we're pushing the portal is that you can sign in being on any chain, because then we don't care what network you're on because we're sponsoring all transactions. So when you're minting the avatar, when you're taking on-chain actions, it's all free. Because I think as fees get cheaper, we're able to basically say, hey, like customer acquisition costs, it makes sense to just cover these fees because we want people to have this kind of easy, delightful experience, right? So yeah, that's something where it's like we don't care about the network, like you say. I think eventually we're going to get to the point where you don't even have to select a network. But I think really with like sponsored transactions and kind of like gasless transactions, you can take that a step further. Where if
Mm.
we're all using the same key pair, why do I care what chain you're on, right? You can take care of that in the back end. The user shouldn't be like, do I need to be on Mantle? Do I need to be on Arbitrum? Do I need to be on ZK Sync? Do I need to be on Ethel1? It's very convoluted from a user perspective.
Yeah. What authentication solution are you guys currently using? Have you rolled out your own, or are you just using something out of the box?
So we're currently using like Web3 modal. I think we've
Okay.
used a couple of different kind of like things, but we aligned on that one. I think pretty much there's like Web3 kit, there's like Web3 modal, there's why am I forgetting the another one? We've kind of trialed all of them and we've bounced around because with each new update, some of them are better, fix some problems. Because again, it's like there's dozens of wallets now, right? And there's dozens of
Yeah.
chains, and sometimes it's like we had some problem with our existing solution not supporting ZK Sync fast enough, right? So we had to jump around, and then another one, it was like, hey, it doesn't support Coinbase Wallet, so we had to do that. So like we've done a bunch of custom work, but I think there's some really fantastic teams that are doing work to get the bulk of it done, and then we're just kind of adding to that stack to improve the user experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So I wanted to ask you something when you mentioned some of the market research that you guys have been doing, and we spoke a little bit at the beginning of the conversation for regarding developers, and also gamers that you've asked different, you've had different questions for. Um, I also meant to ask you if during your research you've come across any trends or any crucial insights regarding the future of blockchain and gaming, or the gaming industry in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a high level, what I found really interesting is that a lot of people are a little like not as excited about like PvP or competitive stuff, like the traditional
Interesting.
like FPSs, right? I think that's a trend that I've been watching, right? Where it's like a lot of people like these team based, right? Or kind of like, how do we work together? They like the PvE, it's like I think that's a trend. And if you kind of look, I forget whose archetypes it is, but it's like it talks about the different archetypes of gamers. And it has like four main archetypes and a bunch of different subgroups. But it's like the vast majority of gamers, 80% is what it's saying, play for the social aspect. It's like,
Right.
and I think that's one of the interesting things for me is like on trend. I mean, if you look at the Surgeon General in the US actually put out a statement that he's like, we're in crisis, a crisis of loneliness. Which for me, that's crazy. It's like they put out something about cigarettes, they put out stuff about other stuff, but it's like loneliness. Like I don't think of loneliness as like a health crisis, but it's ubiquitous. I think COVID really expedited it, right? Where it's like people just feel a sense of loneliness. We're chronically online. We go to social media. We kind of like go to these social sites like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and we're like, hey, like this is where I connect with friends and connect with family, but it's not. It's just farming you for content. It's farming you for engagement. It's serving you ads. It's extractive, right? In the same way that a lot of these like negative game perceptions are, right? But what I think is like really positive and what I'm really pushing for are like more of these MMOS type games or more of these kind of games where you're playing with your friends and you're gonna have this like shared struggle, shared achievement, right? Because if people just want to find connection, right? And I think that's why
Mm.
a lot of the mental model of how we're thinking about structuring Game 7 in this like MMO-esque way with a portal and progression and people working together to achieve things, right? Is it's important because I think people are going to be more and more online. And I think people are more and more lonely. And so basically having these communities that have that game like factor of how do I have these shared struggles and shared achievements and shared accomplishments that bond me to people and make me like feel closer to them, that's the truly sticky thing. And so I guess kind of like from a macro trend, like I think we're going to have a lot less like, 1v1 kind of PvP competitive aspects of it, and a lot more kind of like more communal, like kind of like shared accomplishment, shared group kind of movement. I mean, if you look at a lot of the like past games of the year, a lot of them have not been PvP. They haven't been too competitive, right? It's
It's a
like
good
people like
point.
playing with their friends and having a good time. And yeah, I mean, there's a subset of people who really enjoy that, right? It's definitely a market that's not going to go away. But I think that that big bulk, 80% of people who are playing for the social aspect are just really craving that for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, and I completely agree. Like I've actually played Enshrouded recently with a few of my friends.
Yeah.
For anyone that doesn't know, it's this Valheim-like builder game where you can create your own base and then you can go out and kill mobs and get loot, and it's actually so fun and so relaxing. It's almost like therapy, just building away, talking with your mates. There's definitely, ever since Valheim, I feel like there's more and more games. Like it's created a whole niche of people jumping into this world, kind of connecting and talking and also gaming at the same time. Um, so do you think the problem with people feeling isolated or feeling lonely online has to do with this the dead internet theory, the theory that there are just mostly bots online and very few actual people that you can connect with?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with like the incentive structure around it, right? Where it's like I think like a lot of these things are farming your attention, right? And it's not necessarily for your benefit.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot to do with like the structures. I do think that something that makes it worse is exactly what you talked about, right? Where it's basically saying like with the rise of AI and with the rise of incentives of like more numbers, more vanity metrics allow you to sell more ads, to raise more venture funds, right? It's like you have these kind of like perverse incentives that create this dead internet, right? Where it's like these aren't real people, these aren't real connections. And so I think that's something that's going to become increasingly important is like who's real, who has a real community, and can I engage with these real people? Like having real attention, I think is going to be more and more powerful. And I think that's really going to be predicated on do you have something that real people want to do that's very hard for bots to do. Um, but yeah, I think AI just increases like the negative aspects of a lot of these incentive structures that a lot of businesses have. Yeah,
I think it's visible as well. Like the amount of spam on Twitter, I think it's visible how much it's
crazy
increased since AI. It's
everywhere,
crazy.
Facebook, like all over. It's like the top comment on Reddit. Like every platform, it's like the top comments, or top replies are always just like chat GPT-esque. You're like, this doesn't sound like
Yeah.
a real person. And I think what's going to get weird is like when you can't necessarily tell, because that's going to continually get better and better. And it's just going to be a very odd world. And that's where I think this like notion of like identity and reputation is going to become more and more important as the world gets more and more noisy and more AI driven. People are going to seek that realness out desperately.
Yeah, so you're gonna have to prove somehow that you're human on the internet, but by doing something that a bot couldn't do. And I'm guessing that the easiest way of doing it is just maybe temporarily putting down I don't know, like $5 for a deposit amount to show that you're human, or confirming your identity somehow. Like
I
I
don't
don't know how
know.
else you
I
do
mean,
it.
look at all the blue checks on Twitter, right? I mean, $8 isn't really a big
Good
barrier,
point.
right? And
That's a very
again,
good
that
point.
comes back. It comes back to it's like very real. It's like what crypto is going through, right? Where it's like, how do we find the Sybils? And it's like with enough incentive, and enough time, people are just going to game all of this. And so again, it's like I think that kind of the undertone of what we're doing at Game 7 is really a DID. Like I've been super passionate about decentralized identity for a long time, but I think a lot of people who try to come up with these top down structures of like here's the identity structure that everyone is going to have. Like, unless you're the government, like it's very hard to be like everyone has this ID or everyone has this piece, right? I think what's really I think what really the solution, obviously in my biased opinion, is a lot of these communities having systems like Game 7 has, where you're measuring engagement and contribution. Those start to be these trust anchors that I can say that like, hey, if you are part of 10 different communities and you're level 5 or 6 or 7, right? I can start to have this composite and be like, you're probably a reasonably real person, right? Because even if I'm saying get a driver's license, you can buy a driver's license on the dark web. You
You
can
can,
you can buy
yeah.
access to anything's possible, right? So it's like, but if you're saying, hey, like I want to predicate identity on all these different data points of where you're active, where you're engaged, where you're contributing. If you're part of 10 communities and you put 100 hours into each, it's probably going to be a little bit more challenging for a bot to do. I mean, you probably could buy accounts, and so again, there's a bit of cat and mouse aspect to it, but I really think that's probably a better solution than just like again charging $8 because I see a bunch of blue check mark spam AI bots that have blue check marks and are paying $8 a month that doesn't seem to really be doing it.
No, that's a very good point. And I think for something like Twitter, that's probably where this check would have to like it's as much as a company like that can do because they're so big. But for smaller communities, you could always go out and create physical events where people meet and connect and have a have discussions. Like I think still the physical aspect of it is probably, well, it is the best way to confirm that someone is indeed human and is real. So all these events, I think they serve a real purpose to confirm that.
For
Like
sure. Yeah.
if you have hundreds of thousands of fans online, but then no one's coming to your event, you might have a problem.
Yeah, yeah. I want to check the IPs, like
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, have a look at those proxy
agreed.
networks. Um, Listen, man, I had a great time, and you've given me an amazing perspective on DAOs and on what you guys are doing, and I think you're doing some amazing work. I'm definitely looking forward to the developments that you guys are going to be making, and I just meant to ask you what are some of the next steps for Game7 and for yourself and for the future of the gaming and blockchain industry.
Yeah, I mean, other than yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, for like the next steps, next step for us, I mean, really is just continuing to help, like, to help the Web3 gaming community push forward, right? I think, like, for us, it's non-zero sum, where we want to partner and work with everybody to push this space forward, because I think it's so much bigger than any one of us, right? And that like all of us together can do something so deeply powerful and world changing. And those are the kind of people we like to work with, and those are the goals we kind of like to set. So like right now, it's like going app.game7.io, like leveling up, engaging. We're doing a bunch of fun kind of like different activations, partnerships, distributing tons of rewards and things like that. But if you're really passionate about shaping the future of Web3 gaming, we would love to have anyone there, right? I think there's a space for anyone to contribute. I think we have a couple of things that are coming up, like Market Wars. I think Hyperplay continues to add games, and there's going to be a couple very fun campaigns as we progress to our road to decentralization for Game7. But yeah, hyper focused on like the next quarter. We have a couple new features that I can't release too much about. We just released Loot Drop with Mantle, so it's like a 2 million MNT kind of campaign that folks based on their engagement and based on their effort, can get larger shares of that pool. But yeah, just engage. Like the only way we succeed is by giving an open space for people to participate and kind of like shape the future of Game7 and Web3 gaming. So hope to see you there and maybe some of your listeners as well.
Awesome. No, I'll definitely keep an eye out on things. I love this kind of stuff. I'm gonna probably lurk in the Discord, but
Yeah.
you'll definitely see me. So that's app.game7.io. Do you have any socials that you want to shout? Maybe your own, maybe the company's.
Yeah, I mean, Game7 definitely. Usually not like too active on my social a little bit. It was like Jonathan T. Allen one because I have a very common name, unfortunately. If anybody knows the Jon Allen who hasn't been active in 4 years and can get him to give me his username, I would love that. But yeah, Game7, search that, and then Jonathan T. Allen one would be mine.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, John. Thanks a lot for the conversation. Thanks for coming here. I had a fantastic time, and I would love to have you again at some point in the future to discuss the new developments and features that you guys have built and to see how your community has grown in the meantime.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks so much. It was absolutely a pleasure talking. Really enjoyed the conversation. Would
Yeah,
love to come back.
likewise. Likewise, man. Listen, have a great rest of your day and take care.
Yeah, you as well. Bye.
Bye. See you, everybody.